In the mind of a serial killer, what role does narcissism play?
Oh, it plays a huge role.
Do you think about things like personality disorders?
Well, I do only because of my background and training, but the ages didn't want any of that because, as John Douglas said, how can I go find somebody that's got an Oedipus complex or something? If you need to go into court to say, why did this crime occur? Very often you're going to get a psychologist that is going to profile the personality. Were they narcissistic? Well, most all of them are. It's not that they want the attention, they want their crime to get the attention
Hmm.
because they don't want to get caught. They get caught, they have to stop. So that kind of mitigates, if you will, against the narcissism. But in their own world, they're getting away with it. That's why they read in the
Hmm.
media, they like to follow the case. They get a great deal out of that. They may even go back. Some of the offenders have been caught that way, returning to the scene or going to a funeral. Many of them went to the funerals of their victims.
Hmm.
It really feeds the omnipotence that they feel, the grandiosity. We all, at some level, want to have control of our lives or control of whatever situation we're in. They want to have control of the victim. And that's why, from a victim perspective, we try to say, look, don't let them get you under their control. In other words, if they try to move you from one spot to another, that's really, really dangerous. That's where something is going to happen, and you can't get away.
The following is a conversation with Dr. Ann Burgess, a pioneer in the field of profiling serial killers. Dr. Burgess has decades of experience with the FBI, getting inside the minds of some of the most dangerous men in the world, including the BTK killer, the Taco Bell Strangler, and Ed Kemper, the co-ed killer. Dr. Burgess has even been portrayed in fiction as the character Dr. Wendy Carr in the Netflix series Mindhunter. Her depth of experience, insight, and care for victims make her a powerful expert for those of us trying to understand human predators. And now, here's my conversation with Dr. Ann Burgess. In the mind of a serial killer, what role does narcissism play?
Oh, it plays a huge role. I think that it really feeds the omnipotence that they feel, the grandiosity that they, as they plan and get away with as much as they do, because most of them do. We don't catch them, right, if you will, right away. So it's a feeder system, I think. So I just say it plays a major role.
A feeder system. So being a serial killer is a way for someone who's extremely narcissistic to feed their ego.
Yes, yes, it just keeps it, and the more they get away with, of course, the more it feeds it. That's why it's so important to catch them early so
Hmm.
that that doesn't get set into motion.
Hmm. And so at the same time, it seems that there's sort of a conundrum in that, they want the attention, and yet you have strategies using media and giving them attention to catch them. How does something like that work?
Well, it's not that they want the attention, they want their crime to get the attention
Hmm.
because they don't want to get caught. They get caught, they have to stop. So that kind of mitigates, if you will, against the narcissism. But in their own world, they're getting away with it and they can read the paper. That's why they read in the
Hmm.
media. They like to follow the case. They get a great deal out of that. They may even go back. Some of the offenders have been caught that way, returning to the scene or going to a funeral. Many of them went to the funerals of their victims.
Hmm. Hmm. And what would be some examples of this? Maybe the BTK killer there was a
BTK
narcissism element
killer.
there.
Right. I think Kemper did too. Most of them would have returned, even some of the current ones, not what I call the more legacy ones, but more of the current ones, can actually get caught that way. They also have to create the crime in an environment that they feel comfortable in. So
Hmm.
that's why when you're profiling and so forth, is you've got to try to find out why the particular place where the victim was killed, why it was that location, what was important about that location. Because it wasn't just a street, or it just wasn't. I can remember one. It wasn't actually a homicide, but it was a abduction of a child and a rape. And it's where that the offender had gone to school as a kid.
Hmm.
So he felt very comfortable in that location, and he had followed her and surveilled her and kept her on. So a lot of that behavior also feeds into the fantasy and builds up, if you will, to the actual crime.
Yeah. And I found it interesting reading your book, A Killer by Design, that with BTK, you even developed a sort of a profile and then a counter strategy with a like a super cop to sort of mirror him and make him sort of feel fed by that. How did that work?
Oh, right. Well, at the time, didn't know it, but remember he had some kind of local position where he monitored the grass level or the environment, and they could have perhaps seen that he was giving out tickets, if your grass was more than 2 inches tall. I mean, things that seem very unusual.
Hmm.
But yet nobody picked it up and nobody said anything. But that I would hope people would think that's if it happened in today's world, but they would certainly make a complaint at least
Hmm.
to City Hall or whoever hires people to measure your grass.
So he's sort of this petty tyrant, and then the media campaign to kind of coach him out is using someone who's sort of a good-looking young, motivated police officer to sort of counter
Could
his
have,
his
right?
comments.
Could have. Now, of course, the way they did get him is remember on an anniversary, he went silent for quite a while.
Hmm.
Now, we don't know what he was doing necessarily. We only have what he says. But on the anniversary, there was a media piece that talked about him, and he had to correct it. He would write in and corrected it. Wasn't quite accurate.
Yeah.
So you had the obsessive compulsive aspect, which is worked for him. That was one way to, and then they were able to trace down I guess it was a typewriter, the church typewriter that he had used to type up the note.
Yeah.
And of course, the other really interesting thing is he was so upset at the detective for turning him in.
Right.
And
The super
it was
cop got
like, well,
him.
you were supposed to keep me secret. You're a conspirator.
Yeah.
So those are all little nuances
Yeah.
of these individuals and how that, but how it plays into the narcissism, which is your initial question, is you see it there. It's
Mm.
very, very important for them.
Yeah. Yeah, and the downfall too, and it seems with the case of the Unabomber as well. He had the manifesto. How did that play out?
That is a very interesting one because if you followed the brother, David, I think his name was,
Hmm.
he had tried to get in contact with his brother, with Ted, and the
Hmm.
brother wouldn't. He was so angry at him for turning him in.
Oh.
And it's interesting that the brother felt so guilty and so wanting to get that part of his life resolved, which he didn't, because I think
Hmm.
Kaczynski died before he never gave in. I think that also shows you the extreme I am right. Here's your narcissism. I am right. You shouldn't have done that. You betrayed the family. But he was Kaczynski was, if you read his papers later on, was very, very angry at everybody. His parents, we blamed everybody for his own inadequacy.
Yeah, and you mentioned the brother too. I mean that role in the story. I think there's a footnote in your book where he's quoted as what he said to his wife or something over breakfast. She's eating cornflakes and says, "Hon, I think Ted wrote that manifesto." Like,
Yeah, that's right.
what a crazy spot to be in.
It was.
Yeah,
It was.
yeah.
And how
So
many people would have done what he did? I mean, it's
yeah,
very interesting of the human behavior.
yeah, absolutely. Um, so if narcissism is often a large role, um, in your work with the FBI and things, you probably try to steer away from getting really medical with the terminology. And yet, do you think about things like personality disorders and defining, profile with a personality disorder, things like that?
Well, I do only because of my background and training, but you're absolutely correct. The ages didn't want any of that because, as John Douglas said, how can I go find somebody that's got an Oedipus complex or something? And he's right, that the labels that we give people
Yeah.
don't do us very well when we're trying to find them.
Mhm,
So they wanted behavior.
mhm,
And now, of course, what we're very interested in is how does that behavior develop? What were the thinking? Thoughts drive behavior. So you still have to get back to their thinking.
mhm. Yeah. So your book is A Killer by Design. I'm curious, what are the elements in the design of a killer? What are those ingredients?
Well, that came from the research.
Hmm.
That all started because the agents, the behavioral science student was getting all these cases from local law enforcement, and they said, we don't know what the motive is. We can't solve these cases. It isn't a bank robbery or it wasn't even, they felt at the time, a sexual crime because there was no evidence left. So that's why the study was set up on 83. We had a list of 83 to select from and narrowed it down to 36 that the agents could go out and interview to find out what was going on. And that's where the actual first chapter of the book that we wrote on sexual homicide was growing up to murder, is what was their early life like that activated some kind of a fantasy that didn't activate that in many, many other young boys that developed into the fantasy. The fantasy was what was so clear, and Kemper spoke so clearly of it. Many of the others spoke of it, even though they might initially say, I don't know why I did it. I don't know why I killed all these people. Well, it's because they really hadn't thought probably much about it. It was just more of the thought comes in and the action follows it.
Hmm. So f fantasy is a big element then in the making of a serial killer.
Oh, it is. Yeah. I mean, you could call it daydreams or random thoughts, but they would, for some reason, focus in on a fantasy, a thought of killing someone,
Hmm.
the murder fantasy, which most people don't have. And so, if you carefully look at their early background, something happens in the growing up in the developmental period that activate something and they may not remember it. I think that's the other really unfortunate part is we found that many of the now killers, as they were interviewed, had not remembered what had happened that family members would have told them. And that happens over and over. Even today, we're doing some cases where the family members, brothers, siblings will say, no, we saw him the way he got abused by his father, and yet he would never claimed he never remembered it. So my question then, of course, is this a psychological term we call dissociation?
Mm.
Is it something that happens that's so overwhelming to the child, getting beaten, whatever is going on, that they block it and think of something else? They put their mind on something else so that it's blocked out. And
Yeah.
that would be a psychological term. And that could be explained. I mean, that would, when you get into court, that's what you can explain. But at the time, the agent didn't want to, he says, how can I find somebody that dissociates?
Yeah.
You can't.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is a very tricky, especially to be dealing with or even interviewing after someone who probably doesn't understand themselves. We can kind of go deeper in that, I think. But one element that I want to get at a little more is control. In your book, there's a line, quote, "Control is the core element of everything serial killers do."
Right.
How does control play into the serial killer?
Well, it's what they're striving for. Well, we all at some level want to have control of our lives or control of whatever situation we're in. They want to have control of the victim. And that's why, from a victim perspective, we try to say, look, don't let them get you under their control. In other words, if they try to move you from one spot to another, that's really, really dangerous. That's where something is going to happen and you can't get away.
Yeah.
So victims are usually encouraged to fight back or to in some way, notify people that you cannot leave and go with them.
Yeah, it's sort of FBI week on my show. So yesterday I interviewed Jim Clemente, who's also a retired
Oh,
profiler,
good. Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
Jim is very clear about this message too. If there is a risk that you are being moved, fight for your life. That's the moment.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Doesn't necessarily mean you're going to win, but
Hmm.
it's better to at least try to do something.
Yeah. Yeah. So this control element is huge. And yet something I find surprising is that control isn't clearly laid out on the psychopathy checklist. Um,
Oh, uh-huh.
what is the gap there? You look like you had another insight though. You were starting catching something else.
Well, on that hair checklist, if you're going for that, it's manipulation. It's very subtle, very clever, and
Hmm.
the more victims they have, the better they become.
Yeah.
Because they usually have had some um, pushback on that, and yet they will try to overcome it. Listen to Kemper when he describes how he would practice stopping, and he would pick up two hitchhikers,
Yeah.
which is interesting. You'd say, well, why wouldn't he just pick up one? Well, no, he wanted to control two, and he did. I think there's most of his victims were two at a
Yeah.
time. So for him, that was a big thing. Now, not necessarily for other serial killers, but that control, it's like the spider and the fly. Once you're into my net, I've got you. You can't get away.
Mhm.
And then he can do what he wants with them. That's what's devastating. And that's often things that we don't find out about because the victim is killed.
Mhm.
But a lot of things can go on in that time period.
So for you in trying to understand these people, what does it take to get into the mind of a serial killer?
Well, you have to have some kind of rapport with him because
Mhm.
he's going to try to manipulate you as
Yeah.
the interviewer. So, one of the things that I did that I don't talk a lot about in my books is my earlier career in psych nursing was teaching students how to interview patients. And so I translated that when I met with the agent because they didn't know what to ask. They said, "Oh, we want to interview all these killers, but what do we say? How do we?" So I use the analogy of aerodynamics. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but we're a flying family. And one of the things in aerodynamics is you can get into a stall.
Mhm.
The airplane loses its lift and you can crash. So they teach you how to avoid stalls. And so I apply that to an interview. How do you know when you're stalling in an
Mhm.
interview? Because you want the interview to go on and
Yeah.
obviously get more and more information. So I wrote chapters on this, recovering from stalls. And most interviewers know that. I mean, you yourself must know when you're doing an interview if you're kind of losing your interviewee, if things aren't moving in your right directions, if all of a sudden a mood change, the person gets
Yeah.
very angry or something. And so you, as a good interviewer, would know how to recover from that, recover from the stall, if you will.
Mhm.
So I did that as much as I did the methodology in helping agents. And there were some agents that you couldn't change them. This is the way I was taught. I just go in there and I ask, what happened and blah, blah, blah,
Yeah.
all of that kind of thing. That's not going to get you into what's in his mind. Sure, you'll get information, but he'll be manipulating you.
Mhm. Yeah. It seems paradoxical that you would be trying to get into the mind, into the shoes, into the life of someone who it seems probably doesn't have that empathy for other people and wouldn't be able to
Oh,
sort of
right.
be in other
Or
people except in a very calculated way.
Well, they could, yeah, I was going to say they can portray that. They can
Yeah.
say that they felt that and so forth. But usually, if you talk to any of serial killers, they will say at the time they felt nothing for the victim.
Yeah.
Now, they may feel, now that they've been in prison for X number of years, oh, they might feel great remorse, but certainly not at the time. Because that wasn't the payoff piece.
Mhm.
The payoff piece was the control and then the kill.
You said you wrote chapters on this. Where can I look up so I can learn better interview skills?
Oh, how did I interview? Well, you must do very well. I did it in my rape book for victims, and
Uh-huh.
they to help a rape crisis center saying, we get a victim. How can we help her or
Mhm.
him? So I put stalls in
Okay.
the my original book, if you've ever seen it. That's called just Rape Crisis and Victims of Crisis. The Purple Bible, they called it. Yeah, we
What?
had to teach a lot of crisis workers how to talk to victims. You wouldn't think nowadays that that would be such a big deal, right? But it was back then. They didn't know about this phenomenon of rape, and didn't even understand the traumatic aspect of it.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I used to be in the Navy, and understanding
Sure.
these processes was something that we were all sort of being educated on when I was in as well.
Yeah.
What do you think makes a good interview?
I think a good interview means that you've been able to connect with the person you're interviewing and really get some payoff information. Information, not just the general information, but the information of what it meant to that person, of what it was like for that person to go through whatever you're interviewing them about. I mean, you must know that there are some interviews that you get really good information, and yet interviews where you don't.
Yeah,
And luckily, you don't have to put the ones that you don't out, right?
yeah.
So
So
you can control what you put out.
yeah, and back to this element of control too. I'm wondering for you, how do you sort of gently control an interview with someone whose sort of mission in life is to have control over other people? I mean, it seems a tricky dance.
Well, one of the things that I recommend you do, and you probably do it yourself, is you do your research before you interview the person, so you know that's something that the agents were so good at,
Okay.
is that they had access to all the prior records, so they knew what the story was, at least what was the given story going into an interview. And then they had to go for it to find out about the fantasy life of these guys. That was very important and very revealing. And many of the agents could not do this. I can tell you that as a fact, that there are only certain agents that really were able to pull off an interview and profile also. Of course, that was the basis for their profiling. That was their payoff, is could they identify enough characteristics to help law enforcement go find the person.
Hmm. So with all of this, you get this interview experience, maybe you have a transcript later, but to understand someone who doesn't understand themselves, maybe, how does that work?
Well, the way it worked, at least in the study we did, is you look for the patterns.
Okay.
It isn't just, I mean, you can say, oh, I just had this incredible interview, but you better check other interviews to see whether the same kinds of, that's where you really can tell if they're trying to control you or put you on or, manipulate you or something like that. So the patterns are important. And that's how we got to the motives, is through the patterns, what we would see over and over with these offenders when you ask them certain things, or you could look through the records and find certain things. So that's how law enforcement works. And we work that way in healthcare, in nursing. We look for patterns in patients' recovery, or patterns in their whatever their complaint is, a medical complaint is. You must do it in your business too. So
Sure.
you look for patterns, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So with this finding patterns and things, I'm still wondering about, you mentioned manipulation with a person whose incentives are different when they're already caught and you're interviewing them. What is the incentive for the manipulation in the first place? Is it just to mess with you, to cause trouble?
Oh, sure. And don't forget, we're in a legal arena when you get in this kind of work.
Okay.
So if they haven't confessed to doing it, you're not going to find out much.
Hmm.
I didn't do it. Well, what can you do with that?
Yeah. Yeah. For someone who has confessed, what are they manipulating for?
Well, they're still manipulating to get you, to get the
Okay.
interviewer, to put it over. It's a cat and mouse kind of. In fact, Campers, and one of them said it was always a cat and mouse
Yeah.
game.
Yeah.
And putting it over on the FBI was a big deal. It wasn't just putting it over
Mm,
on a local police officer.
mm,
They were really king of the block, so to speak, if they could do it with and a lot of the I remember Wrestler was very good because he was very honest, and he says he got me. I know he's manipulating me, and sometimes you play that
mm,
card.
mhm. So you
And
you kind of
and
let them
he
think that
would
they're
draw
winning.
it. What he would do is he'd draw it out, and he says, "Now, come on, that's not really it." And so I remember he did that on Berkowitz.
Uh-huh.
Remember he had a dog speaking to him or something that everybody thought was kind of odd.
Uh-huh.
But Wrestler certainly pulled it out and said, cut it out. And that's
Mhm.
what they would do, cut it out. We know that's not true.
Yeah. Yeah. What was it like for you personally to speak with these people? Were you looking forward to it or afraid? I mean, what's the experience?
Of speaking to what, the agents or the
The
killers?
serial killers.
Oh, well, usually you had a job. The cases that I worked, I was going to be testifying,
Hmm.
on their behalf, if you
Hmm.
will, if I was on defense. I always like to work defense because you get to talk with them. Prosecution, you're not.
Yeah.
So you're only speculating and theorizing and on that. So I always look forward to it to see if indeed it matched. How much did it match from what our research had been? And that's in the book. That's the Henry Wallace case.
Yeah.
Um, I'm trying to think if there are any others. I also sometimes I would do the victims if there was a surviving victim to see, could you get more information from the victim? That's where you find out what really happened, uh, of what
How
they.
does that work? I know that you've written that, you look at victimology. I've heard you, in talks and things that you like to look at victimology first. For those who don't understand, it may be counterintuitive.
Well, it's important because that's in a homicide, that's all you have is the
Mhm.
victim. So
Yeah.
you've got to start there.
Yeah.
And the agents didn't have much experience talking to victims
Mhm.
because they were always looking for the suspect.
Yeah.
So it was kind of a catch-22, and that's where we had to really, and that's why they wanted me to tell them, I could at least tell them what rape victims had said, because these were sexual homicides that we were talking about. So they needed to know what could have happened prior to the murder. And I got that, as I said, from victims. And sometimes I had some surviving victims.
Mhm.
Remember the one that had 8 victims, the Speck who killed the nursing students out in Chicago.
Mhm.
One survived.
Okay.
She even went on television. She used to do interviews.
Mhm.
So
So,
that's where I think anyone that works with offenders needs to talk with surviving victims, and you learn a lot. And it's certainly not like what they say.
and what kind of data can you glean from that, from the discussing something
Well,
with a victim?
yeah, you glean, first of all, you want to glean how much matches and how much doesn't. And that's the discrepancies that you want to go into. Why did he say this happened when it really didn't? Or why did he say it happened a different way, kind of thing? And that tells you more about him and his need to either mislead, manipulate, lie, whatever.
Okay. So the differences are where maybe the
Yeah, it's
payoff comes.
because
Yeah. Okay. And there's another phrase in your book, behavior reflects personality. That's sort of a primary principle for you. It seems in all this noise, all the things that you're trying to gather, that's really important for you to kind of tease things out. How does behavior reflect the personality?
well, that's where you get into the behavior disorders that you wanted to talk about. All of the research that's gone into it. We all are some part of a behavior continuum, I guess you could say. Why do some people do certain things and not others? And that's what you're looking for. And that's how you can explain it. If you need to go into court to say, why did this crime occur? Very often you're going to get a psychologist that is going to profile the personality. Were they narcissistic? Well, most all of them are. Were they obsessive compulsive? Were they schizoid? Were they have no, they've gotten away somewhat in their research on this, and I think that they kind of combine the personality disorders. It's not like it used to be where you had three, and three. I think there were like 9 different ones, and they cluster. And that's
Mhm.
where Hare's work came in,
Mhm.
psychologist Hare. And I think they still use that to a certain degree.
Mhm. And one thing with a serial killer too, people, the phrase MO is familiar.
Oh,
One thing,
right. Modus operandi. That's the way they commit the crime.
yeah.
And where Douglas and the other agents came up with the term called signature. And that's what's really interesting because that's what is more psychologically embedded, if you will, in the offender. He does something because it has some psychological significance, not because it's easier to use a knife or easier to use a weapon or something, which is more the MO.
Mhm.
The MO is probably how do they approach the victim? How do they get her under control? And then what do they do to her?
So this idea of signature, it came up in your book and as something that's really full of meaning. Like what's an example of a signature that would be full of meaning and understanding?
Well, I think the one we give is the use of roping and
Mhm.
tying up a victim. That has something, and that in the John Gilbert case is very important because he was very much into ropes, and he was a Boy Scout, and he got all kinds of awards because of the way his ropes. But it also did him in because he used the ropes that he had been given him from another scout dealer, scout leader who had served in the military and had brought them back from, I don't know, someplace, whether Vietnam or something like that. So it became very hard to locate them in the States because weren't produced in the States. So in a way, he wasn't aware that that was, of course, was going to be his downfall. But the way that he tied the victims up was very symbolic and could have I'm trying to think if it reflected back to how he might have been tied up as a kid.
Mhm. And symbolic?
Well, symbolic would be that's the origin of the trauma
Okay, so it's symbolic of his own
of his
journey.
own. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, the roping was interesting too. It's something about blue fibers on the inside of the
Yeah,
rope or something that it
right,
would give it away, but you wouldn't think of if you just look at the rope from the outside.
right. Yeah, that was a Jobert case, right?
Yeah.
And I
So,
think they used fibers. Don't forget they used fibers in the Atlanta boy killings. Uh, the way the boys were tied up. I think they found that in the offender's car.
mm,
Yeah, fibers. And here, I think he had a dog, so the dog hairs were important. Not that that always is going to, but it would be circumstantial, certainly. Any
mhm.
evidence.
So we're looking a lot at the mind of the killer and even the victim. I wonder what profile makes a good profiler.
Past experience.
Yeah.
You still can't beat experience in the field,
Yeah.
seeing cases over and over. That's what will trigger some thought. Gee, that happened in this case. So let's go back and look at that case. That's why legacy cases are very important. People can say, oh, that's a case that happened 30 years ago. Well, yeah, it did, but still, uh, what can you learn from it that you can apply to a case currently? And
Mhm.
that's what we're doing. We're looking at cases now in the news where they're going to be having a trial to see if there's any historic aspect to it.
Mhm. And so experience, and yet it seems with your crew in the very early days of this, you all had experience, but different experiences. There's not a standard set of experiences that
No,
seem to make a profiler.
no, but it is experience in the field, let's see. And it's experience with that type of case.
Mhm.
That's why many of the instructors down at the behavioral science unit, which is where they were drawing their researchers from, if they had studied bank robbers, they'd be very good at that, but certainly not going to be good at a serial killer. And that's what was unfortunate because they each had their own niche, if you will, that they taught, which is the way education goes. Everybody teaches their own thing, so to speak. So it just so happened that Wrestler really was into this and he interned, if you will, and that wasn't something they called it back then, with two Howard Teeton and Mike Mullaney were the two and they would just sit around and talk with the agents on cases. And, we do that in healthcare. We all, pilots do it.
Mhm.
They talk about their near misses because you're hoping that if you ever get in a tight situation yourself, you can think of something that will get you out of it.
Yeah, like I said, I was in the Navy and I would fly
Yeah.
and went to the Navy's crash investigation school. And, this is what we talked about was case after
Yeah.
case after case. We would even preserve the aircraft and
Yep.
then use that as a teaching tool and say, there's the way that this thing bends or the way that there was sand in the intake and that sort of stuff so that people could look back at the old cases, but be prepared to go out and investigate in the future.
Yeah. Well, every discipline does it that way.
Yeah. So you have this profiling experience, this experience as a professor. Now, what is your work in the courts? What's that been like for you?
Well, that's what's been very interesting is how can I apply what I've learned into the courtroom? Because
Yeah.
I'm a nurse, I'm not, and they will always say, well, you're not a psychologist and you're not a psychiatrist, and as if there's something wrong with being a nurse. And that hasn't gone over too well with juries because most people know somebody in their family has been a nurse. But what's been hard is to make the application. It's a forensic nurse, so it's someone I've worked with a lot of legal type cases and victims. My area being victims and trying to understand what they've gone through and how that plays out in the crime. So that's where they usually will use me of the impact that this has had on the victim.
Mhm. Yeah. And what has that experience been like for you?
Of testifying in court, it's very stressful.
Hmm.
I don't like doing it.
Okay.
But somebody has to do it. I keep hoping that other people will want to do it. It's very stressful. Have you ever had to testify? Because the whole point of your testimony is for them to discredit you.
Yeah.
And a lot of psychiatrists, psychologists don't like it. Any profilers don't like it. Nobody likes being discredited. Well, isn't it true that you didn't do it right? Or isn't it true that you skipped a step? Or how do you know that? I mean, they can, and in front of the jury, it's very hard. They don't let you explain yourself. So I don't like doing it any more than I have to.
Yeah. Yeah.
You could say that.
It sounds tough. What makes it worthwhile for you?
It makes it worthwhile for the victim. No, somebody has to speak for the victim. And I think that that's way back when Linda Holmstern wanted me to work with her. She said, somebody has to speak for the victim. And I said, you're right.
Hmm.
Nobody had spoken. People didn't even know how to speak to a victim. It was like this person was so, they didn't know how to approach. That's why I had to do all of this teaching on how you interview. Nurses and other people always could go in and say, now what's wrong with you? And tell me about this. They just found that very hard to do with a victim
Yeah.
or
And
anybody of a traumatic event. I don't mean just in rape, but certainly the whole phenomenon of trauma has been something that's really a more 21st century phenomenon, even though it's been in the history books. I mean, there's an article that's how old is PTSD?
hmm.
And it goes way back, but it was never called that till more recently.
Yeah. And then you've also written about how the psychology of trauma can really affect the person too, so that they can be impaired in memory, fear response, their attention. So how do you then work with someone who is compromised like that?
Well, that's why in my teaching, I give assignments that are going to be hard, and the students know that. In one of my courses where we talk about veterans, I say you've got to go interview a veteran. And what they find out is this veteran it could be a great uncle, it could be a grandfather, has never talked about what the war experience was.
Hmm.
And so they've had to learn how to talk with somebody that's been through a war experience, a deployment, which is very hard. I mean, it's people don't even like to hear about it. So how do you teach that? They have to do it. They just have to do it.
Yeah.
They want a grade, right?
Yeah.
That's my hold over them, right? I got
Yeah.
to grade you.
Yeah. Yeah. In the psychology of the victim too, there was something that you pointed out that I found really interesting. It was something like that there's this desire to be around people or a fear of being alone, maybe. And yet at the same time, there's a sense of being alone or isolated when you're with other people. Um, what is that experience for the victim, if you have thoughts on that?
Well, that comes from nobody can understand, and people won't talk to me. because that's
Okay.
what happens.
Yeah.
Nobody can understand what I went through.
Hmm.
And in many ways, any personal experience is that. And it's hard to explain something. So that's why we had to work in teaching how to do these interviews. And it gets back to your original question of how do you help people? And sometimes it's going to be just the context. It can be the gender. I always recommend that whenever I do an interview, I go in with a male, and so that sometimes the male is going to relate better or not as well to a gender because it depends on their early experiences. We all represent something when you're meeting someone. It could be a teacher, it could be a parent, it could be a sibling, and that can influence you, right? You can get, unless you're really in touch with yourself, that's where I talk about autognosis. In other words, diagnose your own reaction
Hmm.
when you're in a situation. And if you have to fight against it, if you're saying, gee, she reminds me of this horrible teacher I had in the second grade, you've got to work against it because that's not your teacher from second grade that you're talking to, right? So that's hard to teach.
And so you talked about how you like to work defense, and you have this care for the victims. You've also worked the Taco Bell Strangler as defense as well. What's it like to do defense for that was Henry Louis Wallace, if I'm saying that right?
Yeah,
What's it
right.
like to work defense on a case like that?
Well, I liked working it so I could better explain it. I wanted to see whether what we wrote about worked because he was not one that the agents had talked to.
Okay.
So, and he was, as you said, the other reason is he knew his victims. We had studied strangers. The offenders always had picked strangers. So why did Henry pick someone he knew? He also was of a different race. The agent had only interviewed white serial killers, and Henry was African American, and that was very important. Now, Henry was I think even Ressler said, you'd like Henry. I
Hmm.
think I put that in the book. He was very personable, good psychopath, right?
Yeah.
So you have to know I have a good colleague who just writes on psychopaths because he's had to testify about them in court a lot.
Yeah, yeah. Some of them can really pull one over on
Oh,
you.
they're masters at it, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So, and yet he seems this sympathetic character towards the end of your story that maybe there's something to his upbringing that he was, to the phrase "a killer by design," the title of your book. It seems that there was something in his design that was setting him up. Is there something to that?
There was, yeah. It was his upbringing. It was he grew up in pure poverty.
Hmm.
It was a little house. I have a picture of it somewhere. It had no indoor plumbing. It had no electricity. And he was the only male in a household of females. His great grandmother, his mother, and his sister. Now that makes a difference on a young boy growing up. He was also very big for his age. So more was expected of him because he was big. We do that with people. You're big, you ought to be able to do whatever you've asked them to do. And they would tease him. And the teasing is what would get him. He couldn't tolerate a woman teasing him, even though she just was, nonchalant about teasing him. And that's when he would sometimes go into, and he would talk about his chokehold. And he had a certain way that he would strangle them. There's your signature.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And the signature is, if it's full of meaning, just to be clear, what's the meaning in that as a signature?
In the signature, that would go back to his early experience with being teased. The teasing was more of at least that's what he would tell me, and I agreed with it. How the woman would tease him, and he would get very angry, and that was an original situation where he was picked up by his family for having sex when he was like 6 or 7 with like a 9 or 10-year-old. And I can remember when I got the information from him thinking he's putting me on, this isn't, but interviews with those later, it was right. It was right. And so he got teased in terms of the sister and the mother saying, couldn't you have picked out a prettier girl? They probably didn't think anything of it, but for Henry, that, why couldn't he pick out a prettier girl, whatever that meant to him? That was hard for him to deal with.
So to be clear, is it something as literal as that the idea of choking was to stop the teasing?
Well, he had also seen a rape,
Okay.
a gang rape. That was the other thing at
Mm,
about the same time. So it wasn't just that one thing. He had
yeah.
seen a gang of kids rape a neighborhood girl.
Mm,
And that a visual memory can be very powerful
mm,
and hard to get rid of in your mind.
mm. And then in the beginning, we talked about fantasy. So the visual
Right.
memory is powerful, and then does that stoke the fantasy, or did in his case, was that how this was working?
Yeah, because he did well up to a certain point. He was a cheerleader. Everybody liked him. He got in the Navy. He did very well. And then the old habit came in. He stole something like a hammer from a hardware store and got picked up for that. It was going to be either you can resign or we're going to prosecute you. So handling that is what was his downfall because then his wife, he had married by that time, and she wanted the life of that he had of being in the service. And so she left him. Because I know one of the things I asked him, I said, had you ever thought of raping and killing your wife? Because he picked people that he knew.
Yeah.
And he said he had the thought. He had gone to the house after she had left him and just stood outside or stayed outside, but then couldn't go through with it.
Mhm.
So what does he do? He goes to a replacement figure and kills another person that he knows. So the replacement, I guess is more technically called displacement. You displace your anger and resentment onto another person,
Mhm.
which is what he did.
And sometimes it seems that humanizing people seems to slow these guys down in the moment, when they kind of see a person's
It
character, maybe
can.
something to that with the wife.
Well, it can. It did in Monty Rissel's case.
Right.
Um, I'm trying to think if there are other situations where it does, and it can. A
Yeah.
lot of times it won't. I mean, I had rape victims that would try all kinds of coping things, and it wouldn't work.
Yeah. What do you make of the fascination with serial killers? There's sort of some of them are lionized, they're celebrities in their own way.
Well, it's so much in the media.
Yeah.
And it is something a lot of people, I think, and especially women, they tend to be more likely to be followers, is kind of making sure you stay out of those situations. What can you
Mhm.
learn from it? The other thing is there is a fascination with it that people struggle to explain to and you warn people. Remember, we just had a recent up here in New England of do we have a serial killer on the loose kind of thing, because there were a lot of I was impressed with how many poor people died and people didn't know why they died. Didn't turn out, at least in the cases I've seen, to be a serial killer, but it certainly showed a lot of people dying, unusual circumstances, and points to the fact of do you realize how many unidentified dead we are in this country? There's a lot of cold cases. I mean, we don't do a good job, if you will, on solving a lot of can solve the domestic cases, but not having a lot of luck on solving non-domestic cases.
Hmm. Yeah. And true crime and things, I mean, it is a fascination, and you are a character a character in Mindhunter is based on you. There's a Hulu series about you. What is the media around all of this like? Like, what's it like to be in all that?
Well, I think people then want to know people that work in the field what they're like. Is there something
Yeah.
strange about them,
Yeah.
and anything that they can find, I guess. Um,
Is
I'd
there?
like to think that it's the trauma issue that we've been able to raise so that people have more of compassion for what people go through and horrific experiences.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there something to that? I mean, to be in this line of work, I think I read a sentence in your book or something that was very common for people to lose weight or things like that as they got
Oh,
into the
yes,
profiling and things. It's very demanding.
very demanding. And that did happen down at the academy. I remember one agent that he put on a lot of weight, and then he lost a lot of weight. And it was clearly due to stress, the overeating or the whatever. You've got to be really careful. And that's why you have to build in ways to reduce the stress. You've got to build in what's called supervision, that you go over the cases. That's the way the whole profiling started, is to help agents go over these cases so they wouldn't just sit there and mull over what did I miss? Is there some clue that I missed? When you talk to somebody else that isn't involved in the case, they may have a perfectly good explanation for maybe you did miss something. So it's the only way you learn. That's the other thing. What makes you really good in your field? It gets back to experience.
Yeah. And yet there's such a weight to the experience, it seems, in your field.
Sure.
John
Sure.
Douglas, there's the story of him getting very sick and things like that. Um,
Oh, he almost died.
yeah.
He got some kind of encephalitis. It was awful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean the work, the travel, being under the manipulation of people whom you're dealing with as well. I find that, in life, just the people that you are around, are kind of contagious.
Yes. Yes. Oh, and I can remember being down at the academy, and they would just sit in their office and get call after call, telephone call after telephone call. And they were doing just so much on the phone. And they put the phone down and it would ring again. I mean, they had no relief. It was
Hmm.
really stressful.
Yeah. Um, So, Dr. Burgess, for you now, going forward, what do you see sort of, as you look back on this career, this experience with profiling and everything, as your particular points of pride?
Well, I think bringing trauma to the forefront, that's what and victimization of giving victims a say.
Yeah.
That I feel good about. We certainly haven't reduced any any crime. We've got to do a lot better there. And that's where our next step is looking at how do you get into people's heads before they kill, before they
Mhm.
commit a crime. So get at that early fantasy development. And that's where we're trying to see if we can make some headway there.
I'm curious, are you finding things there?
Well, we have those manifestos. We have
Mhm.
done 23 manifestos. We run through machine learning and topic modeling. That's where we're going. And now we have a backlog so that if we get a new case, we can run it in comparison. So there you're looking for the pattern. It's kind of replicating what we've always done, but it's doing it with AI, which makes a huge difference.
Well, Dr. Burgess, before I ask my last question, where should people find your books?
They can find my book online. It's in a number of places. They can find it on any podcast like yours that is saying where they can purchase it. And evidently the audio vision is version is very popular. People listen to it. I don't know if that's good driving in their car. I don't know. I always say sometimes a lot of women find it a little scary. So I always suggest that they have a large German Shepherd dog by their side when they're reading it.
That's a good plan. Well, we'll put links to that in the description for people to check out. And Dr. Ann Burgess, my last question is that you put a lot of emphasis on recognizing the victims in all this. I wonder what's a story of a victim who has thrived after one of these experiences that we've talked about.
I wish I could give you a list. Well, that's one of the things we talk about in the next book is what all the victims that we talked about in A Killer by Design. I've tried to update and find out where they are and how things have gone. And it isn't always easy to find that. It's a situation that just stays with the person. But
Mhm.
I would point people to like someone like Andrea Costin, who has done very well and established a foundation and is helping women who particularly have to go to court and testify. So that's a very specific place. So she's been very, very good. But a lot of victims still don't even want to be identified. Some of the, like Larry Nasser, having a lot of victims. So I hand it to any case. There's several right in the news as we speak that I think that's pretty brave to go forward and talk about their victimization so that people can understand it.
Well, Dr. Ann Burgess, thank you for your contribution to that and for taking this interview with me and for your book. I really appreciate this.
Thank you for inviting me.
To help raise awareness about narcissistic abuse, please share this video. It helps a lot.